Over the course of the last century, video games have made a tremendous transformation regarding its shift and relevancy to the market. We now have a huge demand for video games from AAA studios. These studios appear at huge events like E3, where over 66,000 people go to see new games being unveiled each year. One of the most popular genres of games are the first-person shooters. Games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Doom are all examples of first-person shooters. Wolfenstein was the very first-person shooter to be released in 1992. Many games took the format of Wolfenstein and put their own spin on it. Doom is a notable game that blew many people away, notably for its intense gore and non-stop action. The first-person shooter genre carried itself up till today, where there now exists multiple games that garner huge attention due to its popular online competitive formats. But how did this phenomenon of a format begin? Where did it all start? Well, Alexander R. Galloway dived into this topic in his essay Origins of the First-Person Shooter. Galloway begins his essay by talking about the representation of the movie theater. You enter a two-dimensional space while one sees the projection of a three-dimensional space. So then what about video games? It's technically the same thing as well. However, there is one key difference. You are in control of the character you play as in the given narrative. But then at the same time, it was commonly mentioned how movies are becoming more and more like video games. This is because both video games and film have begun to influence each other in many different ways. I mean, one look at the Avengers series and it feels like you're playing through the final level of a difficult, long game. Many movies like The Matrix or Panic Room also have video game-like elements and were criticized for looking too much like a video game. However, Galloway wanted to stress on a more specific and more niche technique called the first-person subjective camera angle. In cinema, this angle is meant to replicate the feeling of alienation, detachment, fear, or even violence. Turn your attention to one of the super moves in hit fighting game Tekken 7. Negan from The Walking Dead appears as a guest character. In his super move, he knocks his opponent onto his knees before delivering a final blow to the head with his bat. Notice how the change into first person makes Negan seem more like a menacing and towering character. Keep in mind, Negan in The Walking Dead is just a regular person. He's just some dude with a baseball bat. But putting the victim in the first person creates an illusion of overwhelming dominance. The first person shot, as Galloway puts it, is to achieve an intuitive sense of motion and action in gameplay. First of all, let's dive more into the first person shot, or known also as the subjective shot. This technique is considered to be the fourth look, as described by Paul Willeman. The four looks are the camera's look, the audience look, the intradiegetic look between characters, and the final look, the look of the viewer, represented by a view of a character. This look is generally avoided because it forces the audience to confront a scene from an angle that cannot be viewed from a, quote, voyeuristic position. When the camera fuses with the character, we as the viewers become the character's eye, thus the first-person subjective shot is born. This shot is seen as a challenge as they are problematic forms of vision. However, let's not forget about another technique known as the POV shot. The POV and subjective shot are vastly different. The POV shot shows approximately what a character sees. It shows a perspective from the character's vantage point. Subjective shot is meant to show the exact physiological or emotional qualities of what a character would see. Using Negan's execution blow from Tekken 7 as an example again, we can see how this is a subjective shot, not a POV shot, as the camera is swaying and a vignette is formed to show daze and signs of shock from the initial blow of being knocked down to your knees. As an added bonus, if you listen to the original sound clip, Negan's voice is also muffled and a ringing voice can be heard as well to enhance the idea of injury.
Lucille, give me strength.
With these techniques, coupled with the subjective shot, makes this sequence of events more brutal. A POV shot is more commonly used to present evidence to the audience that is necessary to drive the narrative forward. One example of this in cinema is the movie Casablanca, when Ilsa's goodbye note is pasted on the screen so that the audience can read it. Many other films like Rear Window also uses similar tactics. In this scene here, we are placed in the POV of this man watching through these windows. The camera pans and follows the characters behind the window. This may in fact seem like a subjective shot as the pan seems to follow the eye, but we're not given any emotional or physiological evidence of what the characters are feeling. To incorporate this, the camera pans back at the characters to show their emotions when seeing the events unfold before their eyes. Now that we've declared the differences, we can now talk about the problems these shots create when used in film. And because of this, when it's used, it's meant to serve a purpose. Very rarely will we see a film dominated by a subjective shot. One of the first Hollywood films to try and incorporate this is Lady in the Lake. It was so largely groundbreaking that they even marketed it as a movie starring you. The concept of the movie is that you follow the eyes of Detective Marlowe, and you are a lead detective on a murder case. The whole movie follows Marlowe's perspective, and every other character in the movie reacts and engages with the camera like so. Unfortunately, Lady in the Lake was regarded a failed film, as critics referred to the subjective shot as gimmicky and flawed. To quote, "It was more tiring than fascinating." Many shots in the movie, like this mirror scene, breaks the illusion of the subjective shot and pulls the audience out from immersion. So with all these problems that are prevalent, how does one fare when using the first-person subjective shot? This is where Galloway calls upon another medium, video games. More specifically, the first-person shooter. In earlier games like Wolfenstein and Doom, the first-person shooter games are played in the subjective shot, but Galloway argues that the second important piece to a first-person shooter is the player's weapon, which usually sits in the right foreground of the game. This visual idiom constitutes the kernel of the image in the first-person shooter genre. However, before the existence of first-person shooters, there were elements from it that were used in cinema. One notable example is in Buster Keaton's Go West, when a bull charges right at him. We can see here when the bull charges at Buster Keaton, the horns are hovering in the foreground like a weapon. This gave the shot some more character, and also some urgency when it charged directly at him. There are many more examples sprinkled throughout cinema history that borrows elements from the first-person shooter. More notable examples are Spellbound, The Great Train Robbery. Both of these movies use the subjective first-person shot to heighten specific emotions in the viewer. The shots in these movies were specifically meant to form trauma and shock. In conclusion, Galloway's main point was how the subjective shot was used scarcely in cinema because of how risky it was. However, with the advent of video games, a new set of possibilities opened up for the subjective shot. In first-person shooters, it's used to give the player a sense of motion and control. It isn't just a random shot to throw in perspective. It was meant to relay much more than that. Fear, alienation, disorientation, or predatory vision are just a couple examples of emotions that can be relayed through the first-person subjective shot. However, much like Lady in the Lake, we have yet to find a movie that can rely on the first-person subjective shot heavily to carry a movie's style or narrative. There were attempts with movies like Cloverfield and Hardcore Henry, but Cloverfield just moved back to traditional filmmaking after the first movie, and Hardcore Henry is, Thanks for watching this in-depth review of Alexander R. Galloway's essay, The Origin of the First-Person Shooter.